There's a disturbing conspiracy in place to control your mind. But what is it, and how long has this been in place? This is the story behind one of the most peculiar conspiracy theories to arise in the internet era alone, that of the A440 tuning. The basic scenario is that something as mundane as how we tune our musical instruments, the correct pitch, A standardized to 440 Hz, has been weaponized by sinister forces who wish to seed global discontent. Now, according to the A444 conspiracy, as we'll call it, populations that consume music based off this tuning standard are not only more easily controlled, but more agitated, more susceptible to illness, and more likely to fight amongst themselves and be generally unsatisfied. Proponents of the A444 conspiracy believe that if we only used a lower standard for a concert, A432 Hz is most often proposed, then the natural resonances of the universe would alleviate many of the societal ills facing us today. Yet, here we all are, stuck listening to music tuned to A440 standard. This conspiracy takes us into music theory, acoustic science, music history, New Age philosophy, and more modern fears surrounding groups who are supposedly dedicated to keeping humanity from ascending to a higher state of being. Sounds a little New Agey, right? Hear me out. Like all conspiracy theories, following the A440 conspiracy isn't like following a straight line. It's more like tracing a spider web, very complex, with each issue branching off into multiple directions. Now, I'll do my best to present the basics of the issue as clearly as possible. The significance of standardized pitch, how it was decided, how the conspiracy arose, and what it entails, and any evidence supporting the idea that a lower tuning might have beneficial effects on human physiology. We'll also explore testimony from people who claim to notice a difference between A440 and A432. Now listen up, you might not have heard this before. Before we continue any further, we have to discuss some basic music theory. In order to understand how the A440 conspiracy works, and if it holds any real merit. The bad news is, those of you with music degrees will find that this is a repeat of what you learned in theory class. But the good news is, you don't have to drop 40 grand on it this time around. Now, bear with me here. A vast majority of our art, music, and popular music today is based upon theories founded in Western music. In Western music alone, each octave is divided into 12 notes, a series of equally distributed half steps between pitches. Using these 12 pitches and a formula of whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, as we skip between them, we derive the 8-note major scale, the basis for the term octave. These octaves repeat again and again, displaced even higher, or even lower, depending on the capacity of the instrument playing them or the voice singing them. So in reality, our convention of naming notes, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, with flats, sharps, and naturals, is somewhat inaccurate. While it tells you the note's pitch class, it doesn't tell you the precise pitch. Ask a cellist to play an E, and they might respond with which octave. Now, there are various ways to clarify which exact pitch you want to hear. I mean, you could specify its relationship to C4 or middle C, the center note on a piano. But even this is predicted upon the instrument being perfectly in tune with the tuning standard that you have chosen. Now, more on that in a moment. The most accurate means of objectively identifying exactly which pitch you wish to hear from a scientific perspective would be to specify its number of hertz, or cycles per second. For example, if I say play a G, that might mean any number of Gs, theoretically infinite, although by no means all playable. But if I said play 196 hertz, you'd know that I was referring to G3. The G below middle C, the number of hertz doubles from octave to octave. So while G3 is 196 hertz, G4 is 392, G5 is about 784, etc. This specificity would also tell you what tuning standard I was using. I'm sorry, folks. Class will be dismissed in a minute. We'll get to the conspiracy shortly. It's important to understand this background information. Now, at last, this brings us to A440. A440 is the agreed upon Hertz value of the A above middle C, otherwise known as A4. Establishing this as a baseline allows us to determine the Hertz value of all other notes in relation to it. A is one of the open strings on all orchestral string instruments, and this is why, to this day, modern orchestras tune to an A, usually provided by the oboe, which has a louder, more penetrating, steadier sound than strings. It's one of the few things oboes are good for. But there are some problems with the decision to place A4 at 440 Hz. If A4 is 440, then, in Western music, the next nearest note above it and below it are half steps, A flat or G sharp, and B flat or A sharp respectively. Using A440 as a base, these are 414.3 Hz and 466.16 Hz. Therefore, the range on an A to still sound like an A arguably isn't one single frequency. It spans a range of around 50 Hz. Anything above or below it is simply considered out of tune. 50 Hz, that's a big window. You may have noticed that I said agreed upon, and that the designation of A4 at 440 Hz was a decision. Now that's because once upon a time, tuning in classical music, which blended over into most popular music, much like it does today, was like the Wild West. I mean, before the 1750s, no standard tuning existed in all of Europe. Pitches for A4 varied wildly, often from region to region, or even town to town. In fact, one physicist in the 1800s collected more than 300 historical tuning systems. That's crazy, right? Some of these discrepancies were practical. Weather can change the pitch of fixed instruments like pipe organs, whose length cannot be changed, rendering them lower or higher in colder or warmer months. Compromises were sought. String orchestras, composed of instruments using gut strings made from the intestines of animals, often adopted a lower frequency of around A425, since tuning them higher increased tension on the strings and made them snap. Now in Austria and France, the standard for A was 435, though the latter 19th century. Some French cathedral organs tuned their A's dramatically low into the 370 Hz range. That would be somewhere between F sharp and G today. Now in the modern era, some period ensembles playing older music deliberately choose to tune to these lower frequencies to obtain a more authentic sound. On the other end of the spectrum, there was a curious arms race of pitch inflation where orchestras, ever in pursuit of brighter, more brilliant and forceful sounds, were constantly ratcheting up the pitch. Some countries were tuning A4 into the 450s, with England reaching 455 Hz. Whether in music or in finance, notes always be inflating, y'all. Simply put, there was no standard. This worked out fine until the Industrial Revolution had to come along and ruin everything. Now, able to move from town to town via steamship or locomotive, soloists began sitting in with various orchestras, birthing the traveling virtuoso. Imagine their surprise when, after learning their music so carefully for months, they sat down to find themselves grossly out of tune in an orchestra using a different standard entirely. While obnoxious to instrumentalists, this was even more problematic for vocalists, whose physical restraints might render them entirely incapable of performing with an ensemble too far out of tune. In short, something had to be done, or else musicians would be forced to remain in their own regions when performing. Standardization was being discussed more and more often by the mid-19th century, but according to some conspiracy theorists, within these restrictions, some saw the opportunity for mass-scale control. One of the earliest attempts to catalog and standardize tuning arose in the early 1800s. German businessman Johann Heinrich Scheibler, while a silk merchant by trade, nursed an enduring fascination with acoustics. He collected tuning forks throughout Europe, documenting their precise pitches. Parisian tuning forks ranged from 426.7 to 440.7 Hz. Now, in his native Germany, tuning forks from Berlin Philharmonic registered at 441.62 Hz. The widest range came from the Vienna Philharmonic, 6 tuning forks from 433.66 to 444.87. All these numbers, it hurts. This isn't math, this is what lurks beneath. But we'll get to that. Now, in 1834, Johann attended the annual meeting of the German Society of Naturalists and Doctors in Stuttgart. There, he proposed a universal standard known as A440, what became known as the Stuttgart pitch. A few orchestras here and there adopted the measure, but the exact pitch of A4 still varied wildly from place to place. The march towards A440 was slow and came in fits and starts. In 1859, the fight pitch inflation, the French government encouraged A435, while the Music Commission of the Italian government embraced A440 in 1885. Now, Americans eager to sound bigger and bolder, chasing that bright 440 sound, followed suit in the 1910s, pushed by the American Federation of Musicians. By 1926, American instrument manufacturers were using A440. 10 years later, the U.S. Bureau of Standards began broadcasting an A440 tone each hour for musicians and American radio studios to tune by. Okay, folks, here we are, at last, at the conspiracy. Sorry for all that. The meeting that inspired the 440 conspiracy took place in London in May of 1939 and was held by the International Standardizing Organization, or ISO. And no, not ISO like in photography. Delegates from France, Holland, Italy. Here is the important part. Germany joined the British at the home of the BBC to settle the issue of concert pitch once and for all. Representatives from Switzerland and the United States of America expressed their viewpoints through the Post. Out of this meeting, A440 finally took root. Officially, there are several reasons why A440 prevailed. The simplest is that, given the wide array of frequencies in use, 440 Hz seemed to be a reasonable, middle-of-the-road average that served as a suitable compromise. There was also the influence of Sir James Swinburne, an electrical engineer whose pastime as an amateur pianist gave him a compelling argument that 440 would be more easily factored on electronic instruments whenever that day came. There's also the German influence. While war was yet to break out in Europe at the time of the ISO meeting, it was about months away, and Germany was solidly on a war footing by that point, thinking ahead to conquest. Rumors have circulated that the meeting convened by the ISO was either attended by or was organized at the behest of Dr. Joseph Goebbels, one of history's most infamous monsters. Goebbels was chief propagandist for Germany during World War II, and at the time of the meeting, he oversaw Radio Berlin, the chief tool in the propaganda effort, and was intimately involved with every aspect of the organization. Now, according to conspiracy theorists, Radio Berlin was instrumental in convening the ISO meeting of 1939. Now, in 1950, a French musician named Robert Dussault, who was a strong advocate of A432 over A440, wrote that by September 1938, Dr. Grutmacher and the Acoustic Committee of Radio Berlin requested the British Standard Association to organize a congress in London in order to adopt internationally the German tuning of 440 vibrations per second. This congress did, in fact, occur in London, a very short time before the war in May/June of 1939. The presence of Radio Berlin at the ISO meeting certainly gives one pause. But why does the frequency of A4 and the tuning standard built around the system matter at all? I mean, what advantage could the Germans have possibly sought by standardizing music, of all things? Well, it is said that the Goebbels was heavily invested in the standardization of A440. Where he said this exactly is difficult to pinpoint. One website claims that Goebbels used A440 to make people think and feel a certain manner and to make them a prisoner of certain consciousness. In other words, to control them. Now, University of Illinois at Chicago, Professor Ruth E. Rosenberg best summarized what conspiracy theorists believe A440 supposedly does to listeners, quoting several manifestos on the topic. Online iterations of the conspiracy theory today identify what they call malevolent entities. that supposedly use A440 or A440 as a tool of covert manipulation because it causes feelings of stress, aggression, and confusion in listeners. But in a 2010 article online entitled Musical Cult Control, Leonard G. Horowitz argues, the monopolization of the music industry features this imposed frequency that is herding populations into greater aggression, psychosocial agitation, emotional distress, predisposing people to physical illness, financial impositions, profiting the agents, agencies, and companies engaged in the monopoly. Supposedly, 440 is a silent invader that was set into motion nearly 100 years ago by some crafty and conniving philanthropist from information gathered in the late 1800s about the detrimental effects of certain vibration sequences on the human body. The simple tuning of what had been standard for millennia changed from 432 to 440. Today's conspiracy theories about musical tuning are premised on the idea that music tuned to A440 negatively affects the human body or mind and can thus be weaponized against listeners. That's pretty dark. Rosenberg's full paper, published last year in the Journal of Popular Music Studies, is entitled Perfect Pitch, 432 Hz, Music and the Promise of Frequency. It is easily one of the most thorough attempts to academically tackle the topic and comes highly recommended. In short, conspiracy theorists believe that hearing tuning oriented to A440 is bad for your health, bad for your brain, and makes you prone to violence. A lot like hearing All I Want for Christmas Is You. Please, no more Mariah Carey. We're done. We're past that. Whether true or not, World War II interrupted the full implementation of A440 as an international standard, believe it or not. Because it wasn't until 1953, well after Germany had been defeated, that the standard was reaffirmed. If Germany wasn't behind the persistence of A440 in the post-war era, then who was? Well, it depends on whom you ask. Some feel that remnants of the German war machine faded into positions of quiet power on the world stage, pulling the strings nonetheless. There is certainly a precedent for this possibility. I mean, one need look no further than the way the United States government enlisted former German scientists, many of them war criminals, into the space program in Operation Paperclip. Now, I know many of you watching this are well aware of what Paperclip is. Others contend that it wasn't Germany's lingering influence that propped up A440 in the post-war years, but rather a sinister cabal of banking families or secret societies. The malevolent entities Rosenberg referred to, the usual suspects behind so many modern conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theorists contend that these forces are alive and well today, seeking to pit human beings against one another, sowing discontent in service of their own nefarious agendas, and they are behind our modern-day political and social divide. Imagine that. So, if not A440, how should we be tuning exactly? As we've alluded to here and there, most people opposed to A440 believe that we should be tuning our instruments based upon the A432 standard. The idea appears to have its own origins in the wake of the ISO meeting. Earlier, we quoted French musician Robert Dussault, who advocated for lower tuning. Apparently, a cadre of fellow French musicians all felt the same way, including musicologist René Dumasnil. Now, he claimed that the organizers of the 1939 decision first asked musicians, engineers, instrument makers, physicists, etc., whether they would agree to 440, and whoever would not agree was simply not invited. Now, the idea that a lower tuning is preferable or less harmful is one thing. To suggest that a lower tuning of A432 is actually beneficial to human beings is another approach entirely. This idea remained largely dominant until the A440 conspiracy was revived, or created by far-right political figure Lyndon LaRouche, who ran for president 8 times before passing away in 2019. LaRouche's controversial lifetime was characterized by regular forays into conspiracy theory, and it is he who is largely credited with reviving the A440 conspiracy as we know it today. Rosenberg summarized LaRouche's contribution such as it is. In 1989, a LaRouche entity called the Schiller Institute had petitioned the Italian legislature to abandon the standard pitch used worldwide as a musical tuning reference in broadcasting, musical instrument manufacture, and in educational and arts institutions. Instead of using the international standard pitch of A440, LaRouche's petition argued that Italy should adopt a slightly lower pitch reference, such that the note A above middle C would instead be tuned to A432. The 1989 campaign had hoped to change the standard pitch of elite institutions of opera and orchestral music in order to protect revered classical repertoire and voices. Today, though, the issue of tuning to A432 is no longer about performance practice, but instead about the potential implications of frequency for those who consume music, irrespective of genre. Now, to support this argument, LaRouche drew upon what he perceived to be historical precedent. He argued, accurately, the 19th century Italian composer Giuseppe Verdi had sought to curb pitch inflation, and in doing so, had promoted the use of A432. LaRouche's ideas may have simply tended towards traditionalism, but as is often the case, ideas that modern systems are deliberately suppressing older, pure ways of living naturally crept into the A440 conspiracy. Around the same time as LaRouche's petition, advocates for A432s started espousing their beliefs that somehow Goebbels and the Germans were involved in promoting A440. Still, by and large, they avoided any claims that A432 was somehow beneficial. It wasn't really until the rise of the internet that the A440 conspiracy took its modern shape, full of New Age wisdom and suggestions that the lower tuning standard somehow benefited one's physical, mental, and spiritual health. If a modern flashpoint for the resurgence of the 440 conspiracy exists, it is probably a 2014 live Q&A hosted by the rock star Prince. Now, Prince, who had ignored most of his fans' questions, enthusiastically directed them to a website when asked about the importance of tuning music to A432. The website included quotes, videos, demonstrations, and audio presented by everyone from no-name musicians to luminaries like Nikola Tesla and Albert Einstein, all of which brought into question the A440 standard. Among them was the claim that it is said that the 432 Hz vibrates with the universe's golden mean, pi, and unifies the properties of light, time, space, matter, gravity, and magnetism with biology, the DNA code, and the consciousness. The number 432 is also reflected in ratios of the sun, earth, and moon, as well as the precession of equinoxes, the Great Pyramid of Egypt, Stonehenge, and the Sri Lanka, among many other sacred sites. These claims have only strengthened in the past few years. As recently as 2021, a meme circulated on Facebook reading, Jimi Hendrix, along with John Lennon, Bob Marley, and Prince, all tune their music to a specific frequency of 432 Hz. It is known as the beat of the earth. It has substantial healing benefits, and ancient Egyptian and Greek instruments were discovered tuned to 432 Hz. However, since 1953, all music has been since tuned up to 440. This frequency has no scientific relationship with our universe and actually causes the brain to become agitated. The Germans in World War II used this frequency against their enemies to make them feel and think a certain way. You may have seen your aunt post that one in between Despicable Me minion memes. Today's proponents of A432 believe that, as the post suggests, the lower tuning is more natural. Some claim that A432 lines up to the natural patterns of solitons, solitary waves known to physicists that propagate with constant velocity while maintaining their speed and shape. Others think the frequency corresponds naturally to the color spectrum. There's also the argument that A432 has a metaphysical component, allowing the flow of energy through the heart chakra. A440, by contrast, stimulates the third eye chakra or the mind. According to one website, we have too long been controlled by our heads instead of our hearts. The powers that be are successfully lowering vibrations of not only the young generation, but the rest of us as well. Now, these destructive frequencies entertain the thoughts towards disruption, disharmony, and disunity. Additionally, they also stimulate the controlling organ of the body, the brain, into disharmonious resonance, which ultimately creates disease and war. At least some of these ideas can be traced back to occultist and theosophist Rudolf Steiner, who supposedly said that music based on C128, the Hertz frequency for C in a 432 tuning, will support humanity on its way towards spiritual freedom. The inner ear of the human being is built on C128. Another line of thinking holds that, given how so many aspects of reality are frequency-based, surely there are some frequencies with which we naturally sync up more. I mean, after all, our hearts, brains all operate on similar principles. Could A432 operate on these natural rhythms as opposed to those defined by A440? Innergarden.org, a website dedicated to alchemy and personal development, had this to say about the natural alignment of A432 to natural processes. The ancients tuned their instruments to an A of 432 Hz instead of 440 Hz, and for good reason. There are plenty of music examples on the internet that you can listen to in order to establish the difference for yourself. Attuning the instrument to 432 Hz would result in more relaxed, while 440 is slightly more tense. This is because 440 is out of tune with both macrocosmos and microcosmos. 432, on the contrary, is in tune. To give an example of how this is manifested microcosmically, our breath is 0.3 Hz, and our pulse is 1.2 Hz. Relate to the frequency of the lower octave of an A of 432 Hz, 108, as a 1/360th ratio and 1/90th. There is so much confusing and conflicting information regarding why A432 is beneficial that it's easy to get lost in all of it. But there is the sense that some sort of objective truth lies behind the arguments of A432 supporters. While we certainly can't be exhaustive about it all, let's try our best to sort out what evidence supports and what evidence refutes the A440 conspiracy. As is probably evident from the thorough history I've provided, there are lots of holes in the idea that A440 somehow serves as a control mechanism. Now, this isn't to say that there isn't anything to it, but more on that in a bit. But let's address some of the most common criticisms of the idea first. Let's separate claims that A432 is beneficial and focus instead on the conspiracy angle of the entire tuning debate. A good place to begin with is, well, at the beginning, the claim that ancient instruments were tuned to 432. There's unfortunately no evidence to support this. The ravages of temperature, humidity, damage, and simply time will all make any instrument fall out of tune. Now remember, strings function based on tension, and tension always wants to release. They might go flat. If they don't go flat, they might snap. If they don't snap, they might fray. And if they don't fray, they might decompose. Remember, some of the earliest strings were made of gut. The ancients may have tuned to 432, but we can't say for certain they did. And secondly, as we've discussed, A432 was never the standard. Outside of Verdi, few composers felt strongly about this specific frequency. Historically speaking, actual tuning of A4 ranged from well below to well above 432 and 440. There is also the practical implementation of the A440 conspiracy to consider. Outside of electronic music, it's extremely difficult for any instrumentalist to be perfectly in tune. Beyond simple performer errors so minute they aren't even audible. The frequency of pitches and the relationship between them is susceptible to a host of environmental conditions, as noted earlier. What's more, not all instruments are capable of being played in tune, even straight off the shelf, even if their A4 is dead set on 440. So if there is an A440 conspiracy, it isn't very well enforced. Orchestras in continental Europe still tune to A442, and so does the New York Philharmonic, incidentally. As mentioned previously, early music ensembles playing older works might tune as low as A415. Until recently, Cuban orchestras tuned to A436 to make their strings last longer under the country's many trade embargoes. Bands that play blues and rock and roll, especially of the more somber variety, might look for a darker sound and tune a little lower, or even make their strings a little looser as a matter of personal preference. Both leave the A440 standard tuning behind, if only slightly. Finally, the A440 conspiracy is predicated on the idea that European musical tradition is somehow more authentic than music found elsewhere in the world. But Western music, with its 12 semitones per octave, is not the only way that music can be performed. It's just what most of us in the modern West are used to. In fact, hundreds of cultures, many of them as old or older than anything seen in Europe, used tuning systems that musicologists describe as microtonal. In these systems, the smallest interval in Western music, the half step or semitone, can be further subdivided into even smaller portions. Many of us wouldn't even recognize these intervals, other than saying, "Oh, that sounds flat," or "Oh, that sounds sharp." Now, in this model, a tuning standard built of around A440 means very little. There's also a great deal of inconsistency among A432 advocates. They can't seem to agree on exactly what A432 does, other than that it is more natural or conforms to whatever spiritual discipline they prefer. Ironically, these are often Eastern religions where we see much more microtonality. Some people even say that 432 is a mistake. The best tuning is actually 528. Now, it's important to note that many modern musicians have fallen away from the 440 tuning. It's not just the domain of the New Age hippies. These musicians find it liberating, more natural, or that using a different tuning adds something magical to their sound. Classical musicians have also embraced the A432 standard. In 1993, Italian operatic tenor Carlo Bergonzi staunchly advocated for returning to A432. Bergonzi, who became famous for his performance of Verdi, said in an interview that the tuning is ideal for voices because Verdi wrote for the registral passage. If tuning is raised higher, the vocal transition between registers is moved around. So, having discussed as many aspects of the A440 conspiracy as best as we can, is there any basis to the superiority of A432? Before we begin, let me stress that none of this qualifies as medical advice and that if you wish to treat any medical conditions, you should consult a medical professional. The evidence supporting the claim that A432 is beneficial to human beings can roughly be broken down into two categories. The subjective, based on listeners' testimony, and the objective, based on hard scientific data. The results might surprise you. Subjective evidence is plentiful. Thousands, if not millions of people specifically seek out recording of popular and classical music, converted to 432 online. There's even an app, 432 Player, that automatically transposes your entire musical library to that of 432. Most people seem to notice an improvement, or at least they think they do. In her paper, Ruth Rosenberg summarized the opinion of A432 advocates by saying this: despite the familiarity of the music and the artist being consumed, these listeners find the sound of 432 distinct and preferable to that of regular/non-converted music. Asked to articulate further, some respondents explained their preference using words associated with timbre. For instance, some said the sound of 432 music was warmer, softer, less harsh, more resonant, richer harmonically, clearer, and less distorted. Some listeners find 432 music to have a better blend between voice and instrument, and reported that slightly down-tuned music has a significant effect on the ability to hear specific background tones. Another felt the music had way more fidelity, and that 432 Hz provides better nuance and reverb. Another commented, the instruments and vocals sound a lot more present, and the instruments express nuances of sound I would not otherwise notice at 440. Now indeed, some listeners report finding that 432 music seems primarily a bodily experience, one that even seems to dampen mental stimulation and negative judgments that might give rise to anxiety. One survey respondent wrote this: takes me out of my head into my heart space. And another, it really cuts all the necessary noise and useless thoughts. Online reviews of the 432 Player note, It's quite different than all the built-in players. It's really peaceful, and I've never had an app that has improved the quality of my life so quickly. My mood is elevated when I listen to almost any song in 432. The 432 listeners I surveyed made similar comments when asked why they choose to listen to 432. It feels like bliss. It makes me feel good. The music feels more alive, making me feel more alive. While most of Rosenberg's findings were emotional, some reported notable physical differences as well. Some claim that listening to music adjusted to 432 alleviates chronic pain, headaches, stress, anxiety, and other symptoms. Others even claim it had treated their schizophrenia, electromagnetic hypersensitivity, work-related injuries, and exposure to toxic chemicals. Now for the objective evidence. Studies carried out by medical professionals. It is now widely accepted that music can have an amazing therapeutic benefit to both the mind and body. Though we are only just beginning to understand how this might work, does listening to music tuned to A432 have measurable effects on our health? This line of research, although just beginning, looks extremely promising. In a double-blind crossover pilot study from 2019, Italian researchers compared vital parameters in patients after listening to the same film's soundtrack on 2 separate days. The first day, the music was in 440. The second, it was tuned to 432. To the researchers' surprise, they noted this. 432 tuned music was associated with a slight decrease of mean systolic and diastolic blood pressure values, although not significant, a marked decrease in the mean of heart rate, down nearly 5 beats per minute, and a slight decrease of the mean respiratory rate values, compared to 440. The subjects were more focused about listening to music and more generally satisfied after the sessions in which they listened to the 432. In other words, the data suggested that music using A432 as a tuning standard indeed reduced one's heart rate. Another Italian study carried out during the 2020 pandemic found that listening to music at 432 is a low-cost and short intervention that could be a useful resource to manage anxiety and stress. An additional study, also from Italy, suggests that listening to music tuned to that can improve sleep in patients with spinal cord injuries. This new research brings our dive into the A440 conspiracy to a poetic close. It seems as though Italy, birthplace of Giuseppe Verdi, one of A432's historical advocates, is leading the change in legitimizing the benefits of A432. But most importantly, I want to know what you guys think. So be sure to let me know your thoughts and opinions on this whole debacle in the comments below. I want to hear them. And if you guys enjoyed today's content and want to see more content like this, be sure to go ahead and slap that like and subscribe button, and you will definitely get more. As always, guys, I love you all. Keep an open mind, and I'll check you guys out in the very next episode.